the increased demand for energy infrastructure will thus drive or pressure governments to find new ways to fund that. And the demand for energy infrastructure, or meeting the demand for energy infrastructure, will far outweigh the fiscal capacity of the emerging markets governments to meet them. We're in a world today where increasing budget constraints met with increasing financial market constraints mean that governments will need to find new ways to fund essential public infrastructure. The traditional procurement methodology that still today is widely adopted in many of the emerging markets does not exploit the value of private sector capital. So we have a conundrum. The emerging markets are looking to position themselves as the engines of growth for the world economy. They will need essential public infrastructure, essential energy infrastructure to meet that new demand, but they don't have the fiscal capacity with which to pay for it, and therefore need to find new ways to mobilize private sector capital. As these emerging markets move to address that conundrum, I'm calling that a transitional change. It's not transformational necessarily, but it is a transitional change, and it will be significant in many of the markets. I myself am a resident of Dubai, a very proud resident of Dubai. I've been based in the Middle East for 10 years, and even in the last 10 years, I have seen many of the GCC governments, if not MENA governments as a whole, actually embark on this process of transitional change. What it will take is a concerted effort from government to adopt the new policies and principles that underpin private sector participation in this essential public infrastructure. It's a mindset change in the first instance, but very importantly, will require the commitment, a broad-based commitment from all the stakeholders. With that level of commitment, I am a fervent believer that that will set the foundation for growth in the emerging markets going forward, most notably here in the MENA region. I'm not actually asked that often to speak on the specific topic of PPPs. I'm a project finance practitioner, and I'll touch upon that a little bit later. But undoubtedly, if you ask 5 so-called PPP experts to define what a PPP is, you'll certainly get at least 6 opinions. It doesn't really matter, actually. Whether we call it P3s or PPPs or public-private partnerships, whatever you really want to call it, in actual fact, in my mind, it doesn't really matter. The definition itself isn't important. It's the underlying principles that underpin what you're trying to get out of a PPP. And Professor Monsef talked very importantly about the element of risk transfer. For a PPP to be truly successful, we need to find ways to transfer a measurable amount of risk out of the public sector and into the private sector, but that's only part of the equation. It needs to be done in a manner that is that achieves value for money, and I'll talk a little bit about value for money when compared to a traditional procurement methodology. There are many different definitions of a PPP, as we've talked about, and in fact there are many different interpretations of how to implement a PPP. I've listed some of them up here on the screen behind me. I won't go through them in great detail, but suffice to say, each and every one of those could easily be interpreted to be a PPP. Those of you who are familiar with the Middle East and North Africa region will know that many of the economies here have actually already embarked on programs, particularly, Kate, we talked a little bit earlier on, in the power sector, where we're seeing markets like Abu Dhabi, Bahrain, Oman, Saudi Arabia, even Kuwait, and soon to be Dubai, embarking on BOOs or BOOT programs for their power needs. And in many cases, actually, the people who are driving this discussion and driving these decisions are looking at it from a purely operational or technical or engineering standpoint. The reality has changed for many of these governments. The economic element or the economic bite has certainly taken hold. And thus the question, well, how do I measure whether or not this is really worth the effort? There is no simple answer to that, in my opinion. Yes, value for money has been widely discussed and widely debated, in some cases very hotly debated, and the problem is that inevitably it will be very difficult to actually quantify down to a dollars and cents analysis whether option A for a PPP methodology or option B for a procurement methodology is better. There's always going to be a qualitative element. The exercise is thus to measure the quantifiable elements, but in the context of the qualitative elements. In particular, I'm talking about risk transfer.